Good evening. I'm Larry Eastland of the John A. Widtsoe Foundation, and very delighted to have Keith Erekson here with me today.
Glad to be here.
We've been Zoom buddies now for the better part of a year.
We have.
Because
half of a pandemic.
Half of a pandemic. Yeah, that's a long time. So now we're together, and that's wonderful. Keith is the immediate past director of the Church History Library. And we were privileged to, as part of our single adult conference in the North America West area, to sponsor several initiatives with the department. And so we're delighted at all the support and help that you gave us over the period of time. Keith, maybe let's start by having you tell us a little bit about you and about your background and what you've done and what you're doing now.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Maryland, served a mission in Brazil. My early career was in the auto industry, auto manufacturing. And then I kind of redirected and ended up with a PhD in history and an MBA. And I was a history professor and a university administrator at the University of Texas at El Paso. And then 8 years ago, I shifted again and went to direct the Church History Library. And then just about a year ago now, I received a new assignment that I'm responsible for historical research and outreach work with a variety of partners.
And what does that mean?
Yeah, so it basically means that we hope to extend the reach of all of the things we do in the department. So we have a historical collection in the library. We have an art collection in the museum. We have the historic sites around the world, and we have publishing efforts with the Joseph Smith Papers and Saints and a variety of other publications. And so my task is to, and in a way they joked with me, they said, you can't make any more stuff. We have stuff. Your task is to help get that to the places that it should go. And so I work in the church with other departments like missionary and seminary institute and family history. And then outside, we'll work with the National Park Service or with, church universities or, so just wherever people are talking about the church and its history, our goal is to kind of get in the mix and help it be better.
Sandra, it sounds like you're kind of a church entrepreneur because you have so many ways in which you can move this.
Yeah, there's really not a shortage of ways of opportunities. Okay. So in some ways, the trick is picking which one to focus on.
Yeah, I've got a question to ask you first, Keith. Why history? Why does that matter? And why does church history matter?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. It's one that confronts everybody who tries to study history or has to take a course. But I think the church history angle is a really interesting one because I like to think about it in there being maybe three layers to this question of why church history. And one of them is kind of an immediate one. For many people, there are elements from our past which are a stumbling block to them. And it's like right in front of them. It's so close to them. That's what they see. It kind of blocks all of the other wonderful things of the gospel. There are these facts from our history that I can't, deal with or wrap my head around. And so I think a first layer is to help turn those stumbling blocks into stepping stones and help people understand and see things in perspective and in historical context. And all of that helps us say, okay, I can make peace with that part of our past, and then I can embrace the fullness of the gospel and everything that's going. I think a second layer is once you do that, as you're trying to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, I think understanding our history can really inform that and really enrich that, because so many things we do are actually historical. But we don't talk about them that way. We say, oh, you should read your scriptures. Well, all of the scriptures are historical texts, and they were all created by authors in certain settings, and they were writing for purposes to audiences. And so understanding the history of the scriptures helps us study the scriptures better and understand them. And one of the things the scriptures teach is that we should remember, and being a disciple, being a covenant keeper is somebody who remembers that God helped me, God was merciful, and I made covenants with God. And so I think that's a second layer. And a third layer, I think, ultimately is, Jesus taught that eternal life is to know God and to know Jesus. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at the dealings of God throughout the past. And then we can see that, and that gives us insight into how God might be dealing with us today, and get insight into God's character, and then helps with things like knowing God and trusting God and drawing closer to God.
I have spent a lot of years studying various church historical people. And one of the things that I've learned is, whether you're looking at Moses or you're looking at Joseph Smith or whatever, they were human beings. I remember there was a book written about Emma Smith, and one of the things they said in there was that those early saints who joined the church because they saw Joseph Smith purely as a prophet, many times they left. But those who saw Joseph Smith as a human being with a prophetic calling almost always stayed. And
great insight.
And I thought, to me, I'm not afraid of Joseph Smith's humanity. What it teaches me is, if God loved him that much, then maybe God has a little place for me and all of my faults and so forth in his kingdom as well.
For sure.
And so it helps me put my own life into perspective, not just the prophet Joseph Smith's life. History also can get exciting. It was just a month ago, I was reading that my great-great-grandfather is the missionary that came back, went to, and on his way back to Utah, stopped in Kirtland, met with Martin Harris, convinced Martin Harris to come to Utah.
Oh, wow.
Went to Utah, got Brigham Young to put up the money, and brought Martin Harris, and was there with Martin Harris as he bore his last testimony and held his hand when he died.
Wow.
Well, that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
My own ancestor did that. So history, I think, also needs to live for us as well sometimes.
Yeah. Finding a personal relevance is really important to the big abstract past events.
Second question I have is, tell me about 4 critical events in your mind in church history after the initial restoration occurred, because we all know what those events are, but tell me 3 or 4 events that occurred since then that you think really stand out in church history over the last couple hundred years.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I've been thinking about it ever since you shared it with me, and that we'd have this opportunity to talk. I ended up thinking about it a little differently than historians might, or the way we often do history. We often put events on a timeline, and we kind of see this came before that, and this caused that, and we see it in a kind of linear way. I'd like to share a couple of moments where there's kind of a cluster of events that all have some overlapping layers. Because one thing that happens when we put on a little timeline, we forget that there are lots of things happening at the same time. And then our own lives, we get overwhelmed because there's so many things going on at work and school and my family and wherever. And so I'd like to share a couple of clusters, if that's okay.
Please.
And so I think the first one, we're saving electricity.
We're saving electricity.
Maybe that was a sign.
Movement. Sorry about that. Let's continue.
So I think the first cluster comes for me in a moment that's kind of in the early months of 1836. And it's, for me, this is a moment where Another way I like to think about history, instead of a one linear timeline, I like to think about it like the hub on a wagon wheel or a bicycle wheel, where there are lots of spokes coming into this hub, and then lots of spokes going out on the other side. And so, if we look at these early months of 1836 as this hub, there are several things coming in, and one highlight is going to be the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and
Right.
that's what it's kind of, when we make the simple timeline, that's what we put, Kirtland Temple in 1836. But there are several other threads that go through there that I think are important that we lose track of. Well, one of them is in the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants, the kind of the preface where God kind of says why there's a restoration and what is needed. One of the things it says is that there would be a great calamity coming, and because of the calamity, God is going to do things to help people. And what it says in there is that God will establish a covenant with the people. So often we think about the temple as like the building, and we think about the dedication and the angels coming and on all of that. But I think there's this other thread running through here of the big thread is that there's a pending calamity, and covenants are the antidote, the solution. And one of the things Joseph learns is that those covenants need to happen in rituals, and the rituals need to have a place. And so the temple becomes the kind of visible manifestation of the big idea that these are the last days, they're calamitous, and we're in danger unless we make a covenant. And so that's one thread that or one spoke that I think is running through these first months. Another one is something that people ask questions about a lot today. They'll talk about the church being an organization that owns property, that has money, that has wealth. And one of the disconnects for people is, well, why should a church own stuff? Our church is just about God and the Spirit and your soul, and why should it own stuff? And I think that shift from being, well, here's a nice story about how I feel close to God, to I need stuff, is in this same moment. Because if the solution to the calamity is making a covenant in a house that's built, well, the Kirtland Temple is the first one, and Joseph had talked about others in Independence, but this is where it comes together. So for me, it's a really significant shift into there's going to be a building, there's going to be a gathering place, people are going to come there. And now we're talking about property, and we're talking about purchasing property. And then over time, you're going to maintain property. And so I think another layer of these moments is Joseph had been talking for a long time about God and revelations, but now the shift, and there's a little bit earlier, they formed the United Firm, and they need to publish things, and we start to see some temporal needs. But this first temple, and now if we imagine the spokes radiating out of this hub, we have now hundreds of temples. This is kind of this moment where it shifts from, here's a great idea that made me feel good, to we need a physical footprint on the entire planet. And this is the first piece. And
Sure.
in Nephi's vision, he sees in the latter days that the saints are all over the earth, and they're small in number, but they've made covenants, and they have faith in God. And so I think this is an important kind of underappreciated layer of this 1836 moment, that is, the church needs to have a tangible physical footprint across the earth. And that's going to bring property. It's going to bring the need for money. It's going to bring the need to comply with laws. It's going to bring the need to cooperate with government, local government, national governments. Sure. And so all of that's going to come later, and it's radiating way out of the hub. But I think in 1836, we shift from a bunch of believers. And the Kirtland Temple comes even before meeting houses. It's our first structure. And so I think it's really significant to say that's where we go from a bunch of people who believe something to we're now a group that needs to own places.
It's interesting you should bring that up, because when the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem is what led to the creation of synagogues, a specific place where you go to worship, a sacred space, and the creation of the synagogues then created what we would today say are wards and stakes and so forth. So this has been going on for a long time. So
Yeah.
it's not unusual for that. As a matter of fact, it seems to be essential to human nature that we have a place that we can go to worship. Now, as Isaiah says, there are three places of worship: your home, the local assembly or ward, and the temple. And so
Yeah.
we kind of look at those three and say, yeah, Isaiah was right. We still have the need for all three of those today.
Yeah. So I think this is a moment where some of these really big ideas take their first real manifestation, and for 180 years later, that's going to continue to reverberate.
Yeah.
But this is a moment, and it's interesting because even the things that happen in the Kirtland Temple, Joseph and those around him don't fully comprehend them. And I'm thinking now specifically about what's now in section 110 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the account of the visits and the
Right.
messengers who bring keys. Joseph doesn't run out and give a sermon and says, hey, they write it in his journal. And it actually stays there for a long time. It's not added to the Doctrine and Covenants in Joseph's lifetime. It comes much later. And I think even today, if you listen at General Conference and some of the things church leaders are saying, I think they are thinking a lot about priesthood keys now, even in ways differently than they did 20, 30 years ago, which suggests to me that we're still kind of unpacking all of the things that happened in that moment, that there was a place and the messengers came, and we're still putting it together, and we may yet gain better views. We talk about, we always have this little thing, we believe that God will yet reveal many great important things. I think sometimes when God reveals those great things, it then takes us a long time to realize how great they are and all of the implications.
And the questions that people are asking today are different than the questions before. Joseph Smith went into the Grove, and one of the questions he wanted answered is, which church is right? Many young people today are asking a very different question. That's why a church.
Yeah.
And so as we began to emerge as a church and in the gospel in the world is emerging and changing at the same time.
Right.
And so therefore, the organization which the church created, which, as you say, started in that period of time, continues to change as the world changes as well. Well, what's the second one?
Yeah. So for the second one, it'll come maybe 40 years, 30, 40 years after this one. I think a key little moment of crystallization for this kind of larger moment comes in the late summer, early fall of 1876. And Brigham Young invites Emmeline Wells to visit with him in his office. And Emmeline is the secretary to the General Relief Society presidency. She's also the editor of a newspaper created by women for women, the Women's Exponent. And she gets this invitation, and she's not quite sure what it means. That Brigham Young doesn't usually invite her to come to the office, and so she goes in, and Brigham says to her that he's been trying for 30 years to get them in to store grain, and they haven't done anything. And so he just says,
so he went to someone who would do it.
He says, I need you to do something. And Brigham's going to die a year later. Brigham's doing a lot of things in the church in these last couple of years, adjustments to the priesthood, quorums, and organization and
Right.
structure. And as they've put together the temple in St. George, they're recording for the first time the endowment. And so Brigham's doing a lot of things to kind of put the house in order.
Sure.
And one of the things in this moment is for Brigham to say, we need to do something. And so Emmeline walks out of the visit and she does the thing that she can do. She's the editor of the newspaper. And so she pens an editorial. And the headline is, Sisters, Be in Earnest. And she tells the little story of a visit with Brigham Young. And it says, and she calls on the women to store grain. And they begin immediately that fall with that harvest. They begin to store a little bit, some gleanings. They harvest things, they store them. And then the trajectory of this decision is almost immeasurable. In the coming years, within like 10 years, they begin to build local repositories to store their grain. And then the women make the grain available to local leaders to help the people who are poor. Right. And so this becomes really the first thread here is it's the beginning of our welfare program, right? Where we have a storehouse, and even the term storehouse, I mean, it's been in the scriptures in the 1930s during the Great Depression. They're going to kind of pull it out, and Harold B. Lee and the Pioneer Stake are going to do things with it, right? But without calling it that, the women are building a storehouse of grain. And so, but then it grows after that. And so they continue to store, they continue to build up the grain that they have. And by 1906, they do some other things with it. The first is there is a fire in San Francisco, the Great Fire in 1906. Right. And so they send grain to San Francisco to help people who've been displaced in the fire. And then in the same year, they send grain to China, where there was a famine. Interesting. And so we have here the early roots of our humanitarian outreach, not just welfare that's kind of helping internally. This is now an outward looking that says people who are suffering in San Francisco and China, we can do things. And so then a decade after that, the grain is sold to the US government for use during World War I. And the women continue to store grain, then they build back up their reserve, but the sale, the money they get from selling the grain, they invest. And then from the earnings off of that investment, they begin to provide health care for pregnant women and children. And so we see the origin of our social services work. And so so many things that we see in the modern church: welfare, humanitarian aid, social services, these family services, this kind of temporal help has its root in this decision. And then the Great Depression comes along, they kind of put the program together. One of the things they boast about is they build a big grain silo in Salt Lake City. Right. And you can still see it there. Yes. But that would be empty were it not for the grain that the Relief Society had been storing for decades. And so they give grain to the church for that project. And then and so the grain becomes an important symbol. It's still part of the logo of the Relief Society. Right. And I think it's a forgotten part, a forgotten root of so many of the things that we do in the modern church. I read an account one time in one of the journals of all the things that the Relief Society was doing during that period of time in terms of growing and storing and then marketing and so forth. Absolutely remarkable. Absolutely remarkable what they were doing. Yeah, it really is. Yeah. So, and it's a shame that it's forgotten. So I hope that this interview goes far and wide. We don't forget that anymore. Absolutely. Absolutely agree. So what's a third one? All right. For me, another moment comes in the first decade of the 20th century. and it overlaps a little bit what we talked about, but it's kind of a different hub. There are different threads running through this, and the event we often talk about is the Reed Smoot hearing,
Right.
and there's kind
Right.
of, and we talk about it in a political way. He's elected, he's not seated, and we have the hearing, and then there's ways that the church interacts politically. But I think there are some other spokes here, other layers in this moment that are also really, really important. One of them is that while he's testifying, Joseph F. Smith is on the stand in the hearing. He's asked about being a prophet and receiving revelation. And they kind of ask, well, how does it work? Or when's the last time you had one? I mean, those kinds of questions. And he gives a really cautious answer because, it's a largely hostile crowd, and he's being guarded. In some ways, it's not so much Reed Smoot that's on trial, but the church as an organization.
Absolutely.
For its secrecy, and do people swear oaths of loyalty to the church or the nation? So he recognizes that it's partly about Smoot, but it's really about the church and what it's doing. And so he's guarded in the things that he says, but he may have been so guarded that when the reports come back in the Utah newspapers of what he said, people read it as if he's denying that he receives revelation. And so we have kind of this moment where that people are questioning the prophet. Does the prophet really receive revelation? Can I trust the prophet? This overlaps with a shift that had begun earlier with the manifesto and the end of plural marriage.
Right,
And then Joseph F. Smith issues a second manifesto. And so now we have two things going on. There was a huge change in our policy and practice, the manifesto. Now there are questions about the prophet and revelation. And so one of the things I see in that moment are some interesting lessons for the current moment. Today, we see in the church policy changes in short time spans that people see in their lifetimes. And there are people who wonder about the prophet receiving revelation, or can I trust the prophet? Or we see in the recent pandemic, people who got their own revelation that was different from what church leaders were teaching. And so I think this moment in the early 20th century is instructive, because a lot of times when we today have a crisis or a concern, one of the tendencies is to think, well, this never happened before. This is so unique to I'm the only person to worry about this, or it's different in my generation because we have the internet. Well, 100 years ago, people were still worrying about policy changes and the prophet, and if we can trust church leaders, and there's national scrutiny. We said, well, this is the Mormon moment, and there are lots of movies about us. And well, there was also in 100 years ago lots of public scrutiny, and in the muckraking journals, there were exposés about the church and what happened.
Right.
There were exposés about the temple in this same moment, and it prompted the book that James E. Talmage wrote, The Temple of the Lord. There are pictures of the temple that someone snuck in, took pictures and leaked them. We think today, oh, that's online. You go online and somebody has secret pictures of the temple. No, this was happening 100 years ago. And James E. Talmage writes the book, and they publish for the first time photographs of the interior of the temple.
And now we take tours.
But so I think that one of the benefits of remembering this moment is that it just gives us context for our current moment to realize that being a Latter-day Saint, being a disciple of Jesus Christ, living in the world but not being of the world, puts us always in tension with the society around us. And that tension prompts questions about God, about the prophet, about the church. And rather than being alone or special or unique in our information age, it's just our flavor of what it means to take up your cross and follow Jesus.
I think many times when we look at some of these historical things, we just look at it as an isolated incident rather than as a part of a greater amount of history that's going on around it too.
Yeah.
And that some of it is responsive to events and things that are happening, and some of it is proactive. There's a little bit of both goes on. I know that, again, with my study of church history, they were working things out too.
Yeah.
Just like we in our own personal lives are working things out. You know, the prophet is also working his personal life out in addition to the church life.
Yes.
And I guess we need to remember that that same thing is true of the Savior, who lived his life in addition to living a Savior's life. He lived a Jesus life that he had to deal with, and he did so perfectly, which makes it possible for us to then say, well, but he did live as a person. So part of why I love my Savior is he knows what I'm going through.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing is true as you look at some of the things the prophets went through. Not everything worked. That doesn't surprise me at all. Not everything works in my life either.
Right.
So
not everything worked in the scriptures.
No.
Yeah.
No.
We read
And
those stories. We shouldn't be surprised.
here you have Moses, who had such a difficult time with his wife that he sent her back to live with her father for a while. Well, hey, an awful lot of people can relate to that. I think the difference that we see now is we have so much in-depth history from Joseph Smith to today, where we only had glimpses of Moses. We only had glimpses of John the Baptist. But today we have a full story on all of that. We see so much more. It on the one side makes it so that it's easier to question, but on the other side, it makes it easier to put in context our own lives. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's number 4?
Okay. The fourth one is a span of maybe 5 or 6 years in the late 1970s. And there's one event in that span that we talk a lot about, the revelation on the priesthood that was received in June of 1978.
Right.
And but if that's the only thing on the timeline, our little simple timeline, we miss a lot of other changes that add to that change and make, for me, what I think is one of the most transformative moments in our entire history. And so I think where I started would be in 1975 on July 1st. That is where I would start this moment. And I get to bring this up a lot because, like I mentioned, I grew up in Maryland. I taught history in Texas. I only moved to Utah a few years ago, and I've been going through the culture shock of living there. It's a very different place from any other place. But one of the things people in Utah would say to me is, oh, what was it like living in the mission field? This is this kind of center and periphery worldview they have. And so one of the things I like to do when they say that to me is say, well, how do you feel living in the mission field? And they do a double take. And that's when I remind them, the Salt Lake City mission was opened on July 1st, 1975. You have been in the mission field approaching 50 years. And that is a shift in their thinking. And I think it's a start of a kind of rethinking or an awareness that the church has a worldwide structure. It isn't just a home church and field, but that the church is a worldwide organization, and it needs a structure that functions in the same way throughout the world. So there are a whole bunch of realignments that then happen. The 70 are changed from a stake calling to a quorum. And
I was a stake 70.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
You're part of this transition. Yeah. And so we get this this general authority structure with general oversight over a worldwide. And
that was a great moment. I think that change is huge.
It's an unstated change that I think is really significant to administering, bringing the gospel to the earth. And then lots of changes underneath with lots of quorums and Area 70 and regional representatives. They play with it over time, but that shift right there in the late 70s to say we need a worldwide administrative structure. And then we have in 1981, they do a kind of thinking, and they come up with terminology that's still with us, even though we've shifted a little bit from it, but they craft a mission of the church, a threefold mission of the church, which kind of takes all of the kind of culture and lived experience and puts a focus on it and says, this is what we are about as an organization. And so that work of focusing becomes essential. One of the things they do at headquarters in this same moment is then they establish 3 executive committees that oversee each of those 3 areas of the mission statement. Those committees are still in existence today. Things that happen at church headquarters have to go through that leadership structure. And
one of those 3 channels.
And so the committees are composed of members of the Quorum of the 12. Each one has a member of the presiding bishopric. Each one has members of the 70, and each one has members of the women's organization presidencies. And so those committees are really the focal point. All of the things that happen come through, and it brings together all of the leadership to have a more united and be on a council basis, to counsel together, to draw in all the perspectives. We also make a first experiment. There's going to be a more significant one later at the end of the 80s, but in this moment, there's a first significant first switch in the way that budgets are handled. Previous to this moment, local activities are funded locally. If you want to build a chapel, you raise the money and you sell food, and so we shift. And by the end of the 80s, it's all a central budget that comes to units, and missionary funding is rationalized so that people pay the same. But we have in this late 70s, early 80s moment, we have this shift to say, if we're going to administer this worldwide, we need to find a common way to administer. And then I think the last little thread that runs through this moment for me is the creation of the Latter-day Saint edition of the scriptures, with the King James edition of the Bible and the triple combination, with integrated footnotes and reference study system. And that does something, I think, to our teaching, to our study, to our teaching, to our practice. And I think that is still reverberating through our what we learn and what children learn and how we teach. But it was a really significant moment to kind of say, here are the scriptures, and here's how we study them and how we connect them. And so these 5 years in the late 70s are making adjustments across the board in the priesthood, certainly, but also in scripture study and in the general leadership and in our mission and in the budget, how we make this come to pass. And I think I just can't say enough about how much. I mean, if you go to church today and say, okay, here's the Latter-day Saint experience, it all comes through the prism of those last few years of the 1970s and early 1980s.
So what about today? What about today?
What about today? Well,
because with President Nelson, it seems like it seems like he's got the car in high gear.
Yeah. Well, as a historian, I always joke, we have hard enough time figuring out what happened in the past. We're really bad at knowing what's going on now, and don't even ask us about the future.
Right.
But you're right. There are a lot of transitions unfolding right now. Some of them are generated internally with decisions that they've made. I think the pandemic has prompted transitions it'll be a decade from now when we'll realize, wow, that was a really significant thing that happened. But I think about my oldest daughter served a mission. She left in May of 2020 and just came home last December. So an entire mission within the pandemic. As I had weekly calls with her, what she did as a missionary at a high principle level is the same thing I did. She preached the gospel, but at the day-to-day level of nuts and bolts,
sure,
it is so dramatically different the way she found people and communicated with them and taught them. Really, I think things that we'll still see in the future. Oh, wow, that was a really significant shift that the pandemic brought to us.
Joseph Schumpeter called that creative destruction.
Yeah.
And that is, you either innovate or you evaporate, one or the other.
Yeah.
And the church is innovating. This generation coming through the system today faces something that no generation has ever in history faced: too much information.
Yeah.
All of history was about more information,
about scarcity,
and about the Bible in different languages, and the people were burned at the stake for making the Bible in different languages, and yet they persisted and they persisted. Well, today it is not a matter of looking up something. It's a matter of, when you look it up, there's 1,000 articles on it, and it's determining what is important enough. On what basis do you determine which of these you're going to look at? And the church faces that too.
Yeah.
The internet and all that's out there, and the church's piece of being able to utilize this technology, well, others are utilizing it too. So
yeah,
it seems to me that we're in the middle of a huge revolution, both inside the church and outside the church, on how to direct information for inspiration and then for motivation.
Yeah, and that revolution really shifts the tools that we need to make sense of it. I think there are two parables in the New Testament that are really instructive to me on this point. One is the parable of the merchant man who's searching for the pearl and searches his entire life, finally finds it, gives away everything to have that. That parable really resonated with converts in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, and that was their story. In some ways, that's Joseph Smith's story. He went to lots of churches, and converts from England resonate with that story, so much so that when the members of the 12 pulled together some of Joseph Smith's teachings into a pamphlet, they name it The Pearl of Great Price. And then 30 years later, that pamphlet becomes one of our standard works. But you mentioned earlier that people today aren't asking that kind of question. The pearl of great price question is, which church is it? Where do I find it? And when I find it, I'll give away everything I have to get it. Well, in the verses immediately after that parable, Jesus teaches another parable, which for me, I think really is maybe the parable for our times. And it's the parable of the fisherman who drops his net, pulls it out, and it's just teeming with all kinds of things. And so he has to go to the shore, sit down, sort it out, and figure out, what does he keep, what does he use? And I think those are the skills that we need today. We're not in a mode, because we've gone from scarcity to abundance. We now go from searching our whole life for one pearl to, I need the skills of sorting and analysis and selection and discernment. And so we have to then study the scriptures differently. We have to teach differently. We have to be aware that what we're doing is sorting, analyzing, discerning, selecting, and filtering out of that net that's overflowing. We certainly can't keep all of that. So what should we keep?
At the same time, Franklin D. Richards, the old apostle, not the younger one, but Franklin D. Richards used the example. He said the gospel is like a jigsaw puzzle. And as you're putting the pieces of the puzzle together, if you come across a piece that you just can't figure out where it fits, you don't throw the puzzle away. You set the piece aside, you keep working the puzzle, and at some point you'll figure out where it fits. And I think part of what is happening today, people get stuck on the one piece.
Yeah.
Whether that happens to be polygamy or it's priesthood or it's whatever it may be, and they get stuck on the piece rather than looking at the puzzle. And I think there are plenty of places to go to look at the beauty of the puzzle. And part of what the church is doing is putting together these pieces. And I think in a marvelous way. I mean, if you go online, you can find articles and videos and helps in just about any area of your life today.
Yeah.
And that was not available even 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. We've got a lot and a lot before us. And so I think the Lord expects a lot of us now.
I think he does. And he's given us the tools. See, that's the beauty of it. He really has given us the tools to do that. You know, as I look back at my mission, for example, I was a Berlin missionary back in the early 60s. The tools we had were pretty primitive compared to the tools that are available today.
Yeah.
But I think the one thing that is consistent is you need to kneel, you need to pray, you need to ask for help, you need to ask for guidance so that you know which tool is the appropriate tool to bring out at a particular point in time. And I don't think that ever changes, you know. I think our ability to reach the Lord and to ask the Lord for help does not change. And once we do that, he then can show us which of the tools are the ones that we ought to be using.
Yeah.
Well, any concluding remarks here?
You know, I think I would just conclude maybe looping back a little bit to where we started with the value of history and historical study. I think it's essential, and it gives us a sense of perspective and a perspective in our relationship to God. Something that Elder Bednar said at the recent General Conference was about our covenants being about our relationship with God. And as I've been thinking about that, you know, sometimes we're tempted to think that our covenant is like a checklist. Well, I did that one, and I did that one. I only have one more. And even ward clerks can generate lists that show which ones you've got and which ones you haven't got. But I think ultimately it's about the event and the ritual, and you perform it and you make the covenant. But we have this other phrase that we kind of just swallow really fast: make and keep sacred covenants. Well, the "and keep" is really really huge. It's really huge.
Yeah.
And so another way we do this, we'll talk about the doctrine of Christ, and we'll say we're going to preach the doctrine of Christ and faith and repentance and baptism and Holy Ghost and endure to the end. Like, no, that endure to the end is a whole lot bigger in terms of my life and my experience. Yeah. I can do the first four on that really quickly, but I think
it's enjoy to the end. By the way, I think that's the correct interpretation. Let's enjoy to the end.
And I think knowing a sense of the history of God's dealing in our own lives, the history of how God has helped other saints who've struggled with things that are similar to me, that can give us the inspiration, the example to endure, to enjoy, to keep those covenants, which ultimately is what is the solution to that calamity that was foretold. Making and keeping and embracing those covenants is what keeps us connected to God.
And for the last 200 years, they have been building on that and making it possible. I think one of the things that always occurs to me as someone who has ancestors that go back pretty close to the beginning, an awful lot of people made it possible for me to be here today and to have this opportunity. And I better not blow it.
Yeah.
I better do it right.
Well, it gives us a sense of humility to kind of see that there is a picture that's bigger than me.
Yeah, people paid a price to make that possible. Hey, Keith, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here. I'm
It's
sorry
been a
the lights
pleasure.
went in and out a lot, but the light inside did not go out. So thank you
right.
so much for being here. And thank all of you who have endured to the end of our conversation. John A. Widtsoe Foundation is pleased to be able to present this and others, and we invite you to participate. We invite you to be a part of our great enterprise, and thank you so much. Goodbye.